It wasn't until July of 2017, I just turned 11, and I said, if the adults are going to do something, I'm going to have to step up and do something. So I decided to found the Truth Gazette in an effort to fight the fake news media.
Brilyn Hollyhand wrote that op-ed, and he joins me now. Brilyn, thanks for getting up with us this morning.
Here with me now to bring some levity to this otherwise frustrating time is Brilyn Hollyhand.
As a teenager from the Truth Gazette, and he's gotten some pretty big names.
One of those upstanding young men and women who are taking matters into their own hands in the media world, 15-year-old Brilyn Hollyhand.
Brilyn Hollyhand is the co-chair of the RNC's inaugural Youth Advisory Council.
Brilyn, that is probably the nicest introduction I ever got. I've got to tell you, I'm impressed.
I wish that other reporters around the country were as smart and talented and knowledgeable about the issues as you are.
Oh, thank you for having me, Brilyn, and thanks for your almost 5-year incredible success with the Truth Gazette. Good for you.
How bad the country is. So I think the American people have realized that when they elected a clown to office, this is the circus that was to follow.
To wake up, we have to start involving my generation and focusing on winning over the youth vote if we want a shot at winning in 2024.
What's up, America? Common sense has officially re-entered the room. I'm Brilyn Hollyhand, host of, you guessed it, The Brilyn Hollyhand Show. Thank you so much for joining us again this week for what is sure to be quite the exciting episode. We've got a lot to talk about. I am kicking off my college campus tour today. This is being filmed in the morning right before I do a Newsmax hit. I'm going to head off to school, do my core classes, and then get in the car and head off to 2 events tonight. But first, I wanted to take the time for long-form conversation. That is the purpose of this podcast, to have unfiltered, uncensored, and unashamed conversations with each and every one of you, where we can deep dive into the topics of the day. More than just a 7-minute segment on a national news network, we can actually have a conversation. We can call out our own party like I'll be doing today. We can discuss things that are uncomfortable to pundits, uncomfortable to party officials, but guess what? They're things that need to be achieved if we're going to win this election. And as of today, what is 42 days? We live in a frustrating time. And as I mentioned at the onset of this episode, common sense seems to have left the building. But when you turn on this episode each and every week, common sense has re-entered the room. And if we can bring just a little bit of that back to your life, well, I'd say this is a successful podcast. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you out there for your support over the past 7 years. I got started in politics at the age of 11. A lot of you have been here since day one, and I genuinely thank you so much. For all of you that have joined along this wild ride somewhere over the past 7 years, thank you, thank you, thank you. This would not be possible without each and every one of you. It has been the honor of my life to get to sit behind this microphone and talk to you every single week. It's been the honor of my life to get to travel this country, to represent not only my little hometown of Tuscaloosa, but the incredible state of Alabama. And this right here is one of those opportunities where I've been pinching myself the past few weeks on this cycle, where I have been pinching myself of how in the world did this little kid, from high school get into this position on a national council? How was this kid sitting in a New York City Fox studio? How did this happen? And all of it's by the grace of God, which a lot of that is what we're going to be talking about today. Again, something that is uncomfortable. Faith and politics is what a lot of people shy away from. And just a spoiler alert for you, it's all we're talking about in today's episode. So if that makes you uncomfortable, I encourage you to dig your heels in, to maybe clench your teeth a little bit, but watch the show, and dart away if you need to. But that's the honest, real, open conversation we're going to be having today. This is the honest, real, open conversation that our party needs to have if we want any shot at winning. So I'll start off with this. As I mentioned this evening, I will be kicking off my Get Off the Sidelines Tour, partnering with Turning Point USA, visiting 6 college campuses in these final 4 weeks before Election Day. Now, a lot of people think I'm crazy for doing this. A lot of people had said, Brilyn, you're sleep deprived. You have, got all your mile points. You're good on traveling. But I feel like this is important. I just finished my Sweet Home Alabama tour, where we traveled to different counties across the state of Alabama, visiting some hometown friends, and then kind of broadening to communities around us to share the book and do the book tour. And all that's really important. I've done a battleground states tour with the RNC, where we've gone into swing states, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and had conversations with everyday Americans, with young voters. And that's very important. But when I looked at my schedule and I saw that I had 6 nights open in the month of October, I said, you know, what can we do to fill these 6 nights with something that's actually going to bring change? And I said, let's go directly to college campuses. I've spent a year and a half strategically making my messaging on social media directly for Gen Z voters. And that's important. You know, when I joined the RNC Youth Advisory Council, I said we need to meet my generation where we are, and that's online. And President Trump listened to that, and he took that advice, and he got back on Instagram. He joined TikTok. You know, has the fastest growing TikTok account. But you can only do so much through a phone screen. You know, Gen Z is getting our messaging through their For You page, and that's incredible. But now let's go directly to their campus and have conversations face to face with them. And I always say this, and we talked about this a little bit last week, but at the convention, every night we had a different theme. Make America great again, make America safe again, make America strong again, make America powerful again. All of that's wonderful. All of that's so important. But what we need to do is make America talk again. That's a bipartisan effort that a lot of Republicans would cringe at. How can we talk with our enemies? Well, the problem is we're viewing our adversaries as enemies, and they're not enemies. They're fellow Americans that we disagree with on the most fundamental of issues, but we still should have open conversations. You know, I hear about this little thing called civil discourse from my parents and grandparents. Apparently, it used to be the common standard here in America, but my generation hasn't seen that, and we're longing for that. We're striving for civil discourse, and I think this election specifically is the perfect opportunity to start that. And I think Gen Z can be the generation that leads the charge with that. So that's why I'm doing this tour. When I sat down with Turning Point USA over the summer to plan out what we were going to do this fall, they said, "What do you want to name the tour?" And I said, "Oh, I've got a simple phrase, get off the sidelines." And they said, "Okay, we kind of like it. It's catchy. Why'd you come up with that?" Well, it's simple. And before I share it with the 6 campuses that we'll be going to, Auburn, Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU, UAB, University of Alabama, Huntsville, before we share with these different campuses, I want to share it with you first. And that's what we're doing this podcast for today. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago that I'm proudly born and raised here in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the college football capital of the world. I understand college football. Every Saturday in the fall, I make a point, if I'm home, to be at the home football games here for the Crimson Tide. And when I'm traveling, I'm known for having whoever's on my staff for the day hold up a little piece of paper to give me updates on what the score is. And I vividly remember last fall, I was in Dallas, Texas, speaking at a RNC fundraiser, the Ritz downtown in Dallas. And it was the night of the Alabama-Texas game, I believe. Very big game if you know anything about college football. And whoever was on staff that night had a little whiteboard, and they would stand up in the back and give me the score. And unfortunately, Alabama lost that game. But as you can see from the helmet that I keep behind me in all of our interviews, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. And so I'm not going to spend this talking about Alabama specifically, but I'm just making a personal connection here that college football is a major part of my life, and I know a major part of a lot of your lives. And if it's not, that's okay, but you at least know a little bit of the roundabout of football, which is what we're going to be talking about today and connecting that with faith. And you're probably wondering, Brian, how in the world are you connecting politics, college football, and faith together in the lead up to this election? We'll just sit back and wait, because that's what this entire tour is going to be about. Because you can't go into a college campus saying, here's my politics for dummies speech. That's not going to work. It's offensive, and it's what the Democrats have tried to do for decades. And clearly that's not working this cycle. So we're going to change it up. We're just going to have a simple, relatable, open conversation with young Americans. It's worked in the college campus speeches I've been honored to give so far the past year and a half. And now that we're honing our message over the next, I guess 5 weeks leading up to Election Day, every single speech will be with this same message. Get off the sidelines. Now, here's the backstory on it. I mentioned that I know, a little bit about college football, that it's a major part of my life, the culture that I grew up in. I understand, and all of you out there understand, that you cannot win a college football game by sitting on the sidelines. Just like you can't win an election by sitting on the sidelines. Now, that message is a little pointed. And a lot of you, by me shaking your hands, going, is he talking to me? Well, yes, I'm talking to each and every one of you out there. Well, first of all, before I say this, let me say thank you, genuinely, for being somebody that is taking 30 minutes out of their busy days by clicking play on this podcast, and by being an active listener, by being somebody that's so involved, engaged, or at least interested that they're willing to hear something. Whether or not all of you in this audience agree or disagree with me, that's okay. But at least you're willing to listen to this conversation. That's a good first step in getting off the sidelines. The second step's the hardest. And I've always said that. I wrote a whole chapter about it in my book about how the second step is always the hardest. Everybody always thinks, oh, it's so important to get off the sidelines. But that second step, ooh, that's hard. That second step is after you've seen the pushback, after you've been ridiculed, after you've gotten the death threats, after you've gotten the hate mail, and you still keep walking, and that's powerful. And so that's my message to everybody out there. Get off the sidelines. Why wait for the next election? For far too long, I've heard Christians and conservatives tell me politics is just too dirty. This cycle is just too much. I've got too much going on. I'm PTA president. I'm leading the Sunday school class. I just don't have time to get involved in politics this cycle. But next time, I assure you, I'll be volunteering. I'll be door knocking. I'll be, sharing conversations in my classes. Next time, I'll get involved. Ladies and gentlemen, not to be a fearmonger or doomsday predictor here on this podcast today, because that's not what we're about. We're happy warriors all here together. But I got to be honest with you, there will not be another election after this one. This is the most important time in American history, where you've heard me say it for a year and a half. My generation has a choice. All of America has a choice between freedom or tyranny. Over the past 3.5 years, we've seen our country come to the brink of tyranny. But that's not the fate that we have to accept. Now, how do we prevent tyranny? Well, it calls for an uprising from Americans to vote against the candidate of chaos, Kamala Harris. And I think that that's what Americans need to do. Now, I've been very clear that a lot of Christians and conservatives out there don't love Donald Trump's personality. And I understand that. I know the guy. I've seen it firsthand. Now, I have a simple message for each and every one of you. Put his policies over his personality. Now, that message, it should be pointed directly at what I call the country club Christians who have clutched their pearls for, the 5 or 6 years that this man has been attempting to save this nation. Oh, he's just too dirty. Well, guys, you're not electing him to be your preacher, you're electing him to be your president. And I think that that's the choice we have in this election. We have a binary system here in this country. Writing in somebody saying, oh, I'm going to do the modest thing. I refuse to pinch my nose. So what I'm actually going to do is just stay at home. Well, that's the whole reason that I'm doing this campus tour, which also should be a church tour. That's the whole reason I'm filming this podcast. And I did a little bit of research on the numbers so that all of you don't just think I'm crazy sitting here today. And I'm going to give you a breakdown of some of those numbers today to start off. So in 2020, that election, that fateful election, 158 million people voted. Okay. The 2020 election was decided by 44,000 voters in the states of Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. 44,000. Okay. I mentioned Tuscaloosa football at the beginning of this podcast. Bryant Denny Stadium can hold 100,000 people. That's less than half the capacity of who will be in attendance at that football game this Saturday. Only 44,000 people. Not a lot at all. Okay. 45 million evangelicals sit out of elections. 45 million evangelicals set out of that 2020 election and have elections before. This vote was decided by 44,000. But 45 million of you decided, I'm going to stay home today. I'm going to sit on the sidelines. I refuse to partake in this process just because of how dirty it is. You see, the problem with that ideology and line of thinking is the process will never get cleaner unless you go clean it up. The politicians sure aren't going to clean up their mess for you. It's up to you to take the 15 minutes to drive to your polling center and vote. It's up to you to realize again that you're not voting for a preacher for your church. You're voting for a president for your country that desperately needs a man of God. Desperately. And that's the choice before us in this election cycle. Getting off the sidelines is difficult. It's hard. I understand that. Trust me, I understand that. It was difficult at the age of 11 to start expressing my public opinion. I got a lot of hate. I still do. The first thing I see every morning is the death threats in my inbox. But guess what? It's worth it. Why? Because one day, my children and grandchildren look up at me after learning about the 2024 election in their history class and say, Dad or Granddad, what did you do to fight for our morals and values in that election? What did you do to get off the sidelines? I don't want to tell them that I sat at home. I don't want to tell them that I was too afraid to express my opinion. I want to be able to proudly and boldly say, I left it all on the field. I did everything I could do to save the country. Now, regardless of what outcome we're looking at that day and time, at least I can say I tried. And that's a lot better than a lot of you sitting out there who refuse to even get out and vote. The most simplest of things. Now, when I say get off the sidelines, I'm not saying necessarily run for office. I'm not saying be a political commentator with a podcast. I'm not encouraging you to fire off mean tweets. I'm simply saying have conversations, to not be afraid to express your opinion. I think a problem here in the country is what we're seeing in the schools, where we're seeing these teachers turn into activists and start drilling this ideology into the brains of even kindergartners. But there's a problem there before we can address the problem with teaching. It's up to the parents and the grandparents and the nuclear family around these children to start instilling those Christian conservative morals and values in the living room before these teachers / activists have the opportunity to do it in the classroom. This is the perfect example of that. Having conversations. It's that simple. Talking to your neighbors, talking to your Sunday school class, talking to your friends, talking to your family. Is it going to make Thanksgiving dinner uncomfortable? Probably, but guess what? That's okay. A little uncomfortableness versus, an eternity of tyranny here in America. Well, man, that's a bargain I'm willing to take. It's going to be okay. Listen, I tell you, I'm in high school. I'm a senior. That's where I'm going as soon as this podcast is finished recording. I still have people since fourth grade that refuse to sit by me at the lunch table because they know my political ideology, because I'm so vocal, whether it's social media or on the news. And that's okay. They're not forced to have those conversations with me. They're not forced to call me a friend or sit beside me. That's okay. But guys, guess what? It's worth it. It's so worth it. And it's so frustrating looking out at the country, having so many people specifically sitting in the pews of churches, like I said in yesterday, and saying, oh, I'm just frustrated with the direction the country's going. I'm so frustrated every time I turn on the news. I'm so frustrated with a nation that my children and grandchildren are forced to grow up in. Well, I have a simple message for you. That frustration can be turned into something productive. That frustration can be turned into voting. Simply voting. I'm not telling you to turn your Facebook page into, a Fox News channel. I'm just telling you to simply go vote, first of all, and have those conversations, second of all. Now, that frustration that all of you have out there, that discontentment that all of you have out there, that can be turned into another football analogy. Now, a lot of you know that the Crimson Tide has 18 national championships. Now, we did not get those 18 national championships by sitting on the sidelines, or number two, if you're taking notes this morning, getting on defense the entire election. You see, you don't win an election, nor do you win a football game cowering in the corner on defense the entire time. You win a football game, 18 national championships, or an election by staying on offense, by putting yourself in a position where you're moving forward, where you're advocating instead of defending yourself, where you're explaining policies instead of running away from them. The Republican Party is on the right side of history, clear and simple. Always have, hopefully always will continue to be. But we have a problem in our party of messaging our right message. You see, I'll go there, and a topic that a lot of Republicans are too afraid to talk about right now, abortion. We are the pro-life party, and we should be proud of that. We should be proud of our stance of protecting the unborn. We should be the pro-family party, the pro-woman party. That should be our messaging. Instead, The Republicans of the past have said, oh, I'm pro-life, and they run away from the podium. Oh, I'm pro-life, and run away from the debate stage. They don't explain why abortion is murder. They just say it like it's a hashtag and sprint for the door. That's a problem. That's why this has been a losing issue for us, because we do not explain our stances. We don't actually explain, first of all, the science behind it. Second of all, why abortion is murder. And third, our ideology behind it, our faith that makes us have these feelings about how wrong it is to kill somebody, whether they're in the womb or fully in life. It's the exact same principle to all of us. We see that clearly, but we haven't explained that clearly. We have to be willing to have those conversations. We have to be willing to get off the sidelines and continue to stay on offense. And it's simple. You don't just have to use the abortion analogy for it. It's just one that is so, hot of a topic right now that I thought it'd be perfect one to talk about. You can put any phrase in there and run with it by simply keeping something in mind, by simply explaining your ideology, by simply explaining your position, by not cowering, by moving forward. This is something so simple and so trivial, but gets overlooked so much. And it's why Republicans have lost every election cycle since 2016. It's why I was so frustrated that I stepped off the sidelines of just being a talking head to found the RNC's Youth Advisory Council that I'm so honored to chair today and represent my hometown and my state. But I think it's that important to say that, when I got interested in politics at 11, when I first took that step off the sidelines, it was because of the parents and grandparents out there that I was frustrated with. It was because I said, oh, don't worry. The parents, the grandparents, my Sunday school teachers, my school teachers, they've got this. Don't worry. We're all going to be all right. And I waited and I waited and I waited. And finally, at the age of 11, I said, I've had enough. They're not stepping off the sidelines. They're cowering in the corner. They're afraid, they're concerned, they're frustrated. I get it. I'm in the same boat as you, but I'm trying to turn that frustration somewhere. Not to make all of the pointed comments today at my fellow Christians and conservatives. I'm going to also point some at my fellow peers, Gen Z out there. For too long, a minority of our generation, albeit a loud minority, have spent their time dyeing their hair a bright color, grabbing a bullhorn, and shutting down a college campus with protesting. We've screamed at each other enough. It's gotten us nowhere. Nowhere except canceling the graduations of students last spring. Nowhere except dissolving into riots that have gotten bloody and violent, looting that has destroyed towns. That's where that's gotten us, and nothing has happened from it. Absolutely nothing. If anything, it's given our generation a bad rap. It's given us a bad look. And when we walk into a room, oh, Gen Z, that's the one that only knows how to scream. You see, I talk about this literally in the very first chapter of my book because I thought it was that important. We've got to stop screaming and start sitting down and talking. We have to be willing to get off the sidelines and actually do something productive and effective. And I don't think that's too much to ask. I think that we can look at the past, decade, if that, and say we've done a lot of talking, a lot of screaming, a lot of crying, a lot of, bullhorn madness at each other. But what's come from that? Nothing. Nothing except setting a bad example for the generations to come behind us. So what we need to do is sit down and have conversations, to sit down and say, oh, I agree with you there, I agree with you there, I disagree with you there. And guess what? If we leave the room still disagreeing on some issues, that's expected and that's okay. But that means civil discourse has come back. Not only has common sense re-entered the room, but civil discourse has re-entered the room as well. And I think that that's a simple task that all of us out there can do. Speaking again to the parents and grandparents tuning in today, that's a conversation you can have with your children and grandchildren. It's that simple. Be willing to have conversations. You see, the problem here in the country, I see two of them in this specific instance, is that we were grown up being told that politics and faith were taboo, that they were off the kitchen table. They're not something that you should discuss. But you see, that's the problem. We don't know how to properly vent our frustration with faith and politics. Instead, we just scream it. We don't sit down and just discuss it like we would at a dinner table. You see, I mentioned this, and we've talked with this before about how controversial the middle three chapters of my book were, the modern day F words: faith, family, and freedom, because faith, family, and freedom are all under attack and are all taboo in modern day America. And when I published that, a lot of people turned their head and say, "What in the world? You can't say that." And I said, "Oh, yes, I can." Because faith, family, and freedom were taken off the table of conversation. And that's why we got into this position today. Because faith, family, and freedom were the cornerstone, the bedrock of the country that survived 248 years. When we take them out and the country started slipping, and we started saying, "Oh, how much longer can this nation succeed?" Well, that's a problem. Maybe we should put that bedrock back in. Maybe we should refound the nation on faith, family, and freedom. It's that simple. Well, the second problem is this. A lot of people out there, and I bet the thought popped into your head when I started this podcast by saying Christians specifically get off the sidelines, the 45 million evangelicals that sit out of elections, that stay at home and don't vote, don't don't use this privilege that we've fought for and earned to vote, to take 15 minutes. Well, a lot of you will use as your defense, "Oh, but the separation of church and state is important. That's why evangelicals shouldn't run for office. That's why evangelicals shouldn't be the ones volunteering in this cycle." The separation of church and state is important. It's very important. That's what you'll say. You see, apparently, though, you haven't done your history. Now, I was frustrated with this constantly coming up, so I did some research before I wrote that chapter of the book on separation of church and state. Actually, the lack of separation of church and state is what I found. You know, in the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. Constitution, do you know how many times the separation of church and state was mentioned? Zero. For those of you listening in the audio version of this podcast, I just threw up a big old goose egg with my hand. Zero. 0 times was it mentioned. Now, a lot of you are going to pearl clutch and act like this is a commandment, that this is something that we were told very early on, just stay away from politics. But actually, it's the opposite. If you look through the Bible, we were commanded the opposite. We were commanded over and over and over again to focus on local and nationwide elections and how important they were to God and his divine plan. So for Christians out there, this is the time to get off the sidelines and pay attention. I mentioned that 0 times was the term or even the concept of separation of church and state mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. You're probably wondering, when did it first come up? It was in a letter by Thomas Jefferson to Baptists at the time, where he mentioned the idea of making sure that every law wasn't necessarily formed around the laws of the church, like per se a monarchy in Great Britain. He didn't say anything about not protecting and empowering the influence of faith in politics. This was a letter to Baptists, to his fellow men, not a decree, not, a declaration or a constitution, not a law at all. This is something that for centuries was the standard here in America. And it was only when modern day politics came around did the Democrats start this propaganda campaign that evangelicals bought into, that, oh, the separation of church and state means that evangelicals shouldn't run for office and that you should sit on the sidelines and not vote. And all of you believed it. And it's so sad and it's so unfortunate. And it's really brainwashed is what it is. And that's why it's so hard to have these conversations in communities that I consider myself a very big part of. This is my fellow friends, my fellow community that I'm talking to today. Yet a lot of you are going to send, fiery emails once this podcast is uploaded and saying, "Oh, Brilyn, how could you go there? How could you relate faith to politics?" And I'll close with this. It's how I've closed every speech for the past few weeks. And again, a lot of heads get turned and they say, "Well, how did he pivot to that? How did he pivot from Kamala Harris's, communist propaganda record to faith and the attacks that we're seeing today?" And I do it very simply by saying this. What we're seeing today in modern day America and in the modern day world around us is spiritual warfare. Plain and simple. That's all it is. Spiritual warfare. There's all these, buzzwords and catchphrases surrounding us right now. There's all these hot topics surrounding what's going on right now, but it can all be boiled down to good versus evil, spiritual warfare, as predicted in the final chapter of God's Word. What we're seeing today, and I'm not saying that we're on any sort of timeline yet or anything's going to happen in certain order. We have zero idea of that. The Bible's very clear of that. But I will say that what we're seeing is plain and simple spiritual warfare, and that's coming from both sides. And that's something that we have to be aware of. And I'm telling you that not to scare you, but to say that in a time when spiritual warfare is so prevalent, when we have a party that's prepared to defend your right to religious freedom and the First Amendment, when you have the opportunity to vote for the party that reopened churches when the other party closed churches but kept strip clubs open, you're just going to sit at home. 45 million of you are just going to continue to sit at home because he put some mean tweets out. Guys, look in the mirror. You're talking constantly, sitting on the front porch of your house about how frustrated you are. Yet 45 million of you could more than sway the outcome of this election, like I said in 2020 was decided by 44,000 votes. Get off the sidelines. Stay on offense. Continue the messaging the right way to glorify God. And make sure that you're fighting spiritual warfare in every sense of that word. Now, every episode of this podcast is not going to be so heavy. It's not going to be so faith-driven. No, faith is the underlying theme of my entire brand, my entire career. But this time specifically, I said, let's take a lot of the news cycle out. A lot's going on right now, and we'll have a lot to talk about going forward with headlines and stories and all these different developments and polling. And we'll do full breakdowns in the next few weeks leading up to the election. But this time specifically, I just felt so passionate as we kick off this Get Off the Sidelines tour to start it by having an in-depth conversation about what that really means. Get Off the Sidelines wasn't just something that fit on the Canva graphic for Turning Point USA to post about this tour. It's something that we felt so significant that we named it the tour because that's the message. That's the message of every speech I'm going to give on a college campus. And it's the message that each and every one of you out there should take to heart and share within your community, whether that's your Sunday school class, your coworkers, your neighbors, your family, your friends, your community around you should understand the importance of not sitting this election out. Get off the sidelines, get on offense. Let's save the country and fight spiritual warfare while we're doing it. I'm Brilyn Hollyhand. This is another episode of the Brilyn Hollyhand Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you would like more of my unfiltered, uncensored, and unashamed opinion, make sure to subscribe to the Brilyn Hollyhand Show anywhere podcasts are available. For more, you can go to BrilynHollyhand.com. That's BrilynHollyhand. And you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter called What's Up America, hitting inboxes every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. for more of my commentary on the top 3 stories of the week. You're not going to want to miss this. Trust me. This is not a time where you're going to just want to wait and do this later. This is important. Start paying attention now. It's very simple. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to the newsletter, all on my website, BrilynHollyhand.com. And a lot of you were asking after the previous episode where you can get signed copies of my debut book that's sitting behind me right now that debuted at number 2 on the Amazon bestsellers list. You can get signed copies on my website as well, BrilynBook.com. I've signed them for you. They're sitting in a warehouse ready to be delivered to your front porch within a week, very fast with our team that's shipping them. So please make sure that you order your book, Brilyn Book, right now. It's all for you. We're so excited to continue this fight, this race, as we get closer to Election Day. As of the taping of this podcast, we're 42 days out, and there's a lot to do and achieve in the next 42 days. And again, that's up to each and every one of you. So thank you. God bless you. I'm Brilyn Hollyhand. This is the Brilyn Hollyhand Show. We'll see you soon.